Right, and here comes the long one. The City of God. While the Western Empire was busy falling, the Eastern Empire was rising to its greatest heights. On the 1st of August, 527, Justinian I ascended to the throne in Constantinople. Justinian, circa 482 to 565, was a man with outstanding administrative skills, vaunting ambition, and the temper of a bull hippo with a migraine. His big dream was to restore a united empire stretching from Spain to Syria. Determined to bring the Italian peninsula back into this empire, he oversaw a series of military campaigns that vanquished the Vandals in Africa and ousted the Ostrogoths from Italy. Nice alliteration there. He reconquered Illyria and southern Spain, and in 540, Rome. I say he, but the campaigns were mainly carried out by his brilliant general Belisarius, perhaps the greatest military commander in history. Justinian was always jealous of Belisarius, who he secretly thought had ambitions for the throne. In fact, Belisarius was unswervingly loyal. Justinian redefined the empire. A natural organizer, he codified imperial law. As part of this, Justinian renegotiated the relationship between the emperor, the empire, and God. The empire was declared to be the earthly manifestation of the kingdom of heaven. And that meant that the emperor was God's representative, God's living icon. In fact, church and state were a single entity. It sounds a bit over the top, but if you entered Constantinople, you would have seen this represented in physical form. The churches were filled with icons and were beautifully decorated. Beautiful music filled the air. On the great feast days, the streets of the cities were filled with richly adorned processions, heading to churches designed to represent the kingdom of God. The display of beauty was helped by the addition of silk. Silk had been jealously guarded by the Chinese for centuries, but in 552 some traders smuggled silkworms out of China, hidden in bamboo tubes. The cat, or in this case the worm, was out of the bag. Okay, so Constantinople was Augustine's city of God made visible. Well, in some ways. Scratch a bit under the surface and it wasn't hard to find the same old violence and intolerance. Jews were forbidden to build synagogues, read their Hebrew scriptures, or testify in court against Christians. And when in 532 rioters attempting to remove Justinian from the throne, he sent in the troops, leading to the deaths of 30,000 people. The rival clans of rioters were grouped around two rival chariot racing teams, the Blues and the Greens. They were split along political and theological lines. Emperor Justinian I was a supporter of the Blues. It was a bit like the association of Catholics and Protestants with Celtic and Rangers football clubs, only with horses. Celtic and Rangers, what am I saying? Only with horses and a lot more death. Right. According to his advisor, Procopius, not has to be admitted the most unbiased observer, Justinian's actions were those of the devil. Sooner one could number the sands of the sea than the men this emperor murdered, Procopius said. In the riots, the church of Hagia Sophia was burned down. Justinian replaced it with a new, even more magnificent building, which still stands there today, although it is no longer a church. In the east, the church and empire were inextricably mixed. While the Pope operated largely independently of direct political influence from the emperor, the Bishop of Constantinople lived above the shop. Not literally, he had a palace. The emperor was his line manager. And the emperor's line manager? Well, that would be God. This managerial structure was outlined by Justinian by an edict of 535. He described how God had given two great blessings to humanity, priest and emperor. God was the ultimate source of law, but he had delegated earthly authority to the divinely ordained emperor, and the emperor was therefore the source of all earthly laws. The priests, meanwhile, had, according to Justinian, responsibility for matters divine. Justinian's Constantinople gave physical form to this relationship, and from the 6th century onwards, court ceremonial incorporated an increasing amount of liturgy. Emperors were crowned in churches from 602 onwards. But there was bound to be tension, not least because of the somewhat blurry line between matters divine and matters secular. Many emperors took a deep interest in theological matters and expected to overrule the patriarchs, as they became known. Around this time, the bishops of the 5 main administrative centres of the Christian world started calling themselves patriarch. They were the leading fathers of the church. We think of it as a title used solely in the Eastern Church, but it first appears applied to Pope Leo I. Like the word pope, it began as an honorific title for any venerable bishop. In the 5th and 6th centuries, the bishops of Besançon and Lyon, for example, were called patriarchs. From the 6th century to the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century, we'll come to that in, well, a few hours probably. In my case, probably several weeks. Over 30% of all patriarchs were either deposed or forced to resign because of fallings out with the emperor. The man who consecrated the new building in 562 was Eutychius, Bishop of Constantinople, and his story illustrates these tensions only too well. 2 years after his starring role in opening the new building, he fell out with the emperor over a theological issue, of course, and was charged with using ointments, eating delicate meats, and praying for too long. He was exiled to Amasea, where he settled down to a monastery and gained a reputation for healing. He healed a blind man and restored a mother's milk so effectively that she ended up acting as a wet nurse to the entire neighbourhood. He was never that holy in office. It turns out people got more saintly the further they moved from Constantinople. Despite Justinian's desire for uniformity, the cracks in Christianity that Chalcedon had attempted to paper over was still evident. Since Chalcedon, the Orthodox view had been that Christ possessed two natures in one person. He was both divine and human. The Monophysites, of course, had never accepted this. To them, they were numerous, Christ was God in the shape of a man. Egypt was pretty much completely Monophysite. Syria and Palestine were also heavily in favour. The Monophysites had friends in high places too. Justinian's powerful, strong-willed empress Theodora, that's 500 to 548, was a devout Monophysite and began to alter the liturgy to reflect her own theological convictions. She even managed to install a new pope, a man called Vigilius, who was made pope by Belisarius. In return for the favour, Vigilius promised to reject the principles laid down at Chalcedon and to adopt the Monophysite creed. Things weren't helped by the arrival of a fanatical, charismatic Monophysite evangelist called Jacob Baradaeus. His surname means the man who has a horse cloth, and refers either to his widespread travelling or the fact that he had a My Little Pony blanket. You decide. Jacob was the bishop of Edessa, and he decided that he would win the East for Monophysitism. Often in disguise, he rode through Syria and Palestine, creating effectively an organised Monophysite church, ordaining several thousand priests and even consecrating some bishops. This church, the Syriac Orthodox Church, is known by his name, the Jacobites. The name is also a nod to James or Jacob of Jerusalem, the brother of Jesus. Justinian was forced into action. He had to do something that looked A, decisive, and B, orthodox. But he couldn't afford to alienate Egypt, because that was where most of the empire's grain supplies came from. Plus, he was scared of his wife. Not to mention that he couldn't get his hands on Jacob. So, in the hope that people weren't paying attention, he condemned someone else instead, the Nestorians, which was a bit of a left-field choice because they had already been condemned in 431 at Ephesus. Most of them had fled to Persia and were outside the empire. But Justinian thought that maybe he could unite the Monophysites and the Orthodox if he found a common enemy. The plan failed, for one simple reason. It was stupid. The Monophysites were angry because they'd hoped for some recognition, and they didn't get any. The Orthodox were furious because the emperor wasn't attacking the Monophysites. Things descended into farce. At one point, even the Pope was kidnapped to ensure that he took the correct side. He was taken to Constantinople, where, although under house arrest, he refused to endorse Justinian's decision and issued his own pamphlets. But eventually he surrendered, admitted all his past errors, signed anything they wanted him to sign, and was released. He died during the journey home. In the end, the definition of Chalcedon became the official statement of faith of Justinian's empire. And after Theodora's death, he jettisoned the Monophysites, who went off to form their own churches, including the Coptic Church of Egypt and Ethiopia. Meanwhile, outside the empire, the Nestorians carried on with their missionary endeavours. Nestorian beliefs were taken into China by a missionary called Alopen. He later invented muesli, probably. There, with a nod to its origins, it was known as the religion of Syria and was given official recognition by the Emperor Tai Tsung in 638. Alongside his pioneering work with breakfast cereal, Alopen wrote a kind of Chinese-friendly version of the Christian story, which was engraved on a monument in China. The story tells how Aloha, the 3-1, The mysterious unbegotten person, seeing that confused humanity was incapable of finding the road to return home, decided to intervene. Ah, so